in terms of raising standards. It essentially is such that 1/3 of the states will be where they are, 1/3 will go a little higher, and 1/3 will go a little bit lower, and at the end of the day, nothing is accomplished, but we have more control from a central authority. So I'll leave it at that for this segment. You'll get another little gem perhaps in the next segment, but I would like to introduce Sandra Stotsky, who currently serves as chair of the Sadler Mathematics Advisory Board and is a member of the advisory board for the Pioneer Institute Center for School Reform. She served on the steering committee for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that's the NEAP, Reading Assessment Framework for 2009. And I have noted here that while serving in the Massachusetts Department of Education, she directed complete revisions of the state's pre-K through 12 standards for every major subject that have been considered amongst the best in the country, as Jamie described a few minutes ago. She was appointed by Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings to serve on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel in 2006, and I'm telling you that I'm short shrifting her on her accomplishments in the world of education, but I'll just turn it over to Sandra Stotsky right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me just get a few papers down here. First of all, let me find out a little bit about you, the audience. How many of you have children in the schools, whether it's Carver or the neighborhood, most of you? How many of you are elected or appointed officials? I know we met some of you, all sitting here in the front row. Very good. Some more back here, too. I don't think we were introduced. Are you from Carver or a neighboring community? Neighboring, okay, that's fine. And how many of you, and this is where I would like to begin my talk about this part of it, how many of you had children before 2011 in the public schools? Oh, that's very good, because then you would be familiar with the standards that I actually worked on and helped to develop when I was in the Department of Education from 1999 to 2003. After 2011, we had more and more Common Core standards introduced, so you would have noted changes, or you would be at least able to notice changes in what your children or grandchildren went through in the schools. What I'm going to do first, and this is how I will outline my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the philosophy that I used as I was developing the standards that your children were taught by until about 2011. The board adopted Common Core standards in the middle of 2010, and so Common Core began to be gradually introduced the following year. Then I'm going to give you a few facts about Common Core and the validation committee on which I served, what its purpose was. I will then talk a little bit about the flaws or deficiencies in both the ELA and math standards. You've heard a little bit about that, but you will also hear more from me. And then I'm going to suggest what I think might be some avenues for people to proceed who have concerns about what is happening in the school curriculum and in the standards and testing areas in your public schools and in any of the other schools that are not public that are also using Common Core by choice. And there is an unfortunate issue there because many of them are doing this for reasons that don't quite make sense because they think their children are going to go back to the public schools at a higher grade, so therefore they're going to use Common Core standards in earlier grades even though they're not under the purview of the State Board of Ed. Let me begin a little bit with my own philosophy. When I approached the development of the standards that I was told to revise or develop in 1999 when I was hired by the department, and I was hired by Commissioner David Driscoll at the time. Some of you may remember him or know who he was. I was bringing a philosophy that came from my own traditional background in Bridgewater, which is where I grew up. I went to Bridgewater High School. I lived in the town of Bridgewater. That's why I know this whole area pretty well. I was trying to develop standards that would raise all kids, because we have gone through about a 50-year decline in this country since about the 1960s in our public schools. Teachers who've been around that long, or others, would know that what we now do in high school is at a much lower level than what we did 50 years ago in high school. The English curriculum, for example, is very different from the English curriculum that I had when I went to Bridgewater High School. As one example, we had a Shakespeare play every year, 9, 10, 11, 12. I don't know any school today that would give children that amount of literature from that period of time. It was a struggle, but that was what the curriculum was, in addition to a lot of other things that were different. We also, in grade 9 or 10, had the entire book of Euclidean geometry. It was called Euclid's Elements of Geometry. Yes, they actually had Euclid that they were using in Bridgewater. Wasn't the book written 2,000 years ago, but it was a newer version of it, but it was proof-based geometry, the most wonderful experience anyone could have in developing logical thinking. Today, your kids are lucky if they have 2 to 3 weeks of proof-based geometry in grade 10 or 11, whenever it might be offered. In any event, my philosophy was to raise everybody. I wasn't trying to close gaps. That wasn't the goal I was given. We were trying to get everybody up, which is a different direction. I was also interested in making sure that the standards reflected content as much as possible, because that was what everything in research that I knew, and I had done my graduate work in reading research at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but from everything we know, content matters. And so I was trying to make sure that the standards we developed had content as much as possible in them. And third, which was very important and is only now being talked about slightly by the USDE and Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, I was given the opportunity, which I didn't appreciate fully at the time, to revise totally our teacher licensing regulations, administrator regulations, and our licensure tests for teachers. And I finally put it all together for myself, realizing that if you wanted to have better standards for students to learn towards, have teachers teach to them, you needed to have academically stronger teachers. Teachers cannot teach what they do not know themselves. So part of my goal was to make sure that we were training the most academically competent teachers we could do at that time, veteran teachers as well as new teachers coming in. We had control over the criteria for professional development. And the goal was to make sure that we could get all kids making academic gains. Now, as Jamie told you earlier, we actually made unusual strides. And I'm sorry I don't have this available for a overhead screen, but you can get a sense of what was happening. There's a black mark here. This is from an NAEP test. And this side lists all the states in the Union. And this is about where we were in 1992 before the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act, grade 8 math. We were about 1/3 of the way down. That's about what that shows you. And then by 2007, which is after all of the standards I had been in charge of revising or developing had taken root and we had had teacher training, by 2007 we are now at the very top by a considerable amount. This is what is at stake right now. This is really, we have maintained being at the top since 2007. This is now 2015. This is what has been remarkable about the gains to many people. But they are only remarkable if you forget that you had to have teachers as well as standards together producing enduring, significant gains. And only now are we beginning to see, in grade 4, for example, in reading, a slight decline. We're still at the top, but we're not that much at the top. So we're beginning to see some changes taking place. What will happen in the next few years, we don't know. The Common Core-based tests are only being given this year for the first time, and we don't know whether those results are going to be reported or not. So this is still a work in progress, and we can only wait to see what's going to happen if we want to take a chance and wait. So that was what I brought to what we had in the state from 99 to 2003 in our major subject areas and with teacher licensure tests and other policies that affected both teachers and administrators. Let's go to some facts about Common Core now, because I had the, possibly by now, the unenviable experience of being on its validation committee, which was formed in 2009. Now, what is a validation committee? Common Core had 3 major groups of people. The first group were the standards development work groups in 2009 of spring, and they were to develop what were called college readiness standards. Who was on that committee? This is when I first became concerned. Mainly test developers. One might say, how come? What would you expect to be on a college readiness committee? If you go around, as I used to, occasionally, asking ordinary people, who would you expect to be in that committee? You would expect high school math and English teachers. We were developing standards in 2 subjects, math and English. You would expect high school math and English teachers and college teaching faculty in math and English, because those are the 2 groups that know, or should know, what high school graduates should know and could know when they went on to college, if that's where they went, or to a career. Well, they were almost nowhere to be seen on those committees. And that was what first puzzled me. The media didn't pick it up, couldn't understand that, even to this day. Why were test development people put on that committee? They were there. Who chose them? We don't know. As Jamie explained, all of this was done by private organizations. I've told reporters for 6 years, try to FOIA or ask questions, but of course you can't FOIA private organization records. So you can't get any information on why these people were chosen, who chose them, what they were doing there. Then there were the standards writers themselves, and both Professor Milgram, who's the mathematician, and I, who were both on the validation committee, have written a great deal, so I'm not going to go into detail about this. He's written critiques and has posted them on his Stanford University website for 6 years, so you can find all of his critiques, 6 pages long, 13 pages long, in detail. If you understand mathematics, you will enjoy them. If you don't know mathematics, as I don't, I'm not a mathematician, I can get up to about grade 7 and that's about it, because I cannot tell you anything much about algebra topics or pre-calculus topics. You have to understand a little bit more about high school math and high school science, which piggybacks off math, in order to understand his critique, which is as much about lower grades as it is about higher grades, but it certainly has major problems, the standards, at the higher grades. In any event, we were trying to get information and never could get information. Our validation committee was the 3rd committee formed. He was speaking to the standard writers in math, because 2 of them had PhDs in math, and mathematicians do speak to other mathematicians. They won't speak to people with EDDs too well, but they will speak to people with PhDs in math. But I was dealing on ELA with David Coleman, who is now in charge of the college boards and has been in charge of the SATs, which you may be familiar with, as well as AP courses, syllabi, and tests, and with Susan Pimentel and one other person who was associated with one of the testing companies. And I could never get any of them to speak to me privately. I simply wanted to find out why they were doing what they were doing with the English language arts and reading standards. but none of them had majored in English. David and Sue, for sure, had never taught English at any level, either K-12 or post. They had never published anything in education. To this day, no one knows why they were chosen to write the standards. And why is this important? Because they were writing what would be our national standards, and we are now, in this country, using standards, and I have said this in print before, so it's not new, but we have somehow put people who might be considered impostors, charlatans, mountebanks, people who didn't know anything about standard writing in English language arts, in charge of the standards that are being used in our public schools. There is something peculiar about the situation. No other country would have done this. They would have had prestigious people in charge of anything they were going to do in their Ministry of Education as far as K-12 standards, because I've looked into what a few countries did when they had new objectives but most countries have objectives as syllabi. They don't actually have standards. In any event, then there was, as I mentioned, a validation committee formed, which Professor Milgram and I were on. We turned out, a committee of less than 30, were the only two content experts on this validation committee, which was charged with making sure that Common Core standards were internationally benchmarked, research-based, and rigorous. I'm sure you've heard the word rigorous millions of times. These standards are rigorous, rigorous, rigorous. Parrots go around talking about how rigorous they are. But no one can define what rigorous means. And as Professor Milgram wrote in his critique, there's no way to get to a STEM major from these standards alone because they are missing crucial topics in math. And as I say, you'd have to be a mathematician or a high school math teacher, whom you should be able to speak to here, and ask how you're dealing with these missing math standards. In ELA, I couldn't find out about some of the flaws, which I will mention in a few minutes. But the point was that we were two of the 5 people who refused to sign off on these standards. The others did, but Professor Milgram was the only mathematician on that committee. Today we are hearing, well, there were some 7 or 8 other math experts, but these were math educators, K-8 primarily, and he was the only mathematician. So the question is, how did this become a validation committee for standards written by people who are unqualified to write the standards they did? We're not saying that they were academically incompetent. They had their own areas of expertise, but not for standards. So this is a very peculiar situation that this country finds itself in, largely because of race to the top money, which Jamie mentioned. I was on the State Board of Education from 06 to 10. I knew what was happening, and we know, and it's on one of the fact sheets that has been published by Pioneer Institute. You have some fact sheets that you could pick up there, and I don't know if all of these facts are on that fact sheet. But we knew then, back in 9 and 10, that we were going to adopt. That State Board of Education, appointed by Governor Patrick, was going to adopt Common Core standards because we were promised $250 million in race to the top money. That was the deal. There were a few other little aspects of the deal, but basically we were going to dump our standards, which produced this kind of phenomenon, for unknown, unproven standards, which you are now living with in your public schools since 2011. They have been gradually implemented so that by now probably almost all of the school curriculum that you have is based on Common Core standards, unless your teachers have been dragging their heels or your superintendent has been doing other things. But the point is, by now, if the tests are beginning, you're probably totally, doing Common Core standards with the curriculum that you have. What are the flaws? Let me go quickly with ELA. With math, I'm not going to say too much. because there is a work I have on my homepage, and Professor Milgram makes available his critique of the math standards, which you can read in detail. I have a one-pager that deals with the major flaws in English, and I will just briefly go through the major flaws, starting with the nature of the standards. They're skills, not standards. Now, what do I mean by a skill? A skill is something like find a main idea and supporting details. Why is it a skill? Because you can apply it to anything. Three Little Pigs, Moby Dick. When you find a main idea, that in itself doesn't tell you the level of reading, the historical or cultural knowledge that you want kids to have. And remember, we were trying earlier in Massachusetts to develop a knowledge base. So if you have the kind of standards that are called standards in Common Core, they are basically skills. You can use almost anything for these skills, and that becomes the issue by the high school level. That is the first issue. The second issue is the fact, and this you may know about from your experience, there was a great emphasis put on writing, not reading. I come from a background in teaching of reading and the research on reading, and we know from 100 years of research that good writers have been good readers. Reading precedes writing. If you want to produce good writers, you must at least expose children to the very best prose you can. You can't make them all into good writers, but you can make them much better readers if you have a good sequential reading program. And Common Core stresses writing, not reading, so your children, not only in English language arts and reading, will be doing a lot of writing, they're also expected to do a lot of writing in math, science, other areas of the curriculum. No one would ever say it's unreasonable for a math teacher to ask a child to explain, but as one first grade teacher has said, how much writing can you expect a first grader to do if they're going to explain why they did what they did in a math problem? And is that really how you want class time, instructional time spent? We're not even talking about testing. There are some other issues. This notion that you're going to develop critical thinking by spending all of that time on writing, that isn't where it comes from. What you're losing is the development of analytical reading and writing, which is what your older English teachers used to do. For example, the one I had at Bridgewater High School, who taught us Shakespeare every year. They taught us how to read between the lines. That was analytical reading, writing, and thinking. And so if you have cut down because of another quirk in Common Core, have more informational text, less literary study, you are cutting down on what the English teacher always did best and well, and that is teach students how to read between the lines of complex literary works. That's what English teachers were trained to do. And if you have informational texts, which are designed to convey information, that isn't what you use for teaching critical thinking. You don't use science textbooks for that purpose, and you wouldn't use a history textbook for that purpose. You would bring together other materials that might contrast different positions, stances, and then have students notice the difference, but that is not what's being talked about in Common Core. In any event, you get some huge problems in your reading English language arts curriculum with Common Core that may escape the notice of outsiders, even school committee members, unless they begin to take a look at the lessons and the assignments. And that is the one thing that has sparked the parent revolt in this country. As parents, who after all tend more than anyone else to look at what their children are doing in school, look at the lessons that have come home when they have come home, they have become more and more upset. So you are now seeing waves of parents, now supported by teacher unions, interestingly enough, not so much teachers, but teacher unions, because they're freer to speak, Teachers have to be careful because they don't want to be suspended or have their licenses revoked. There's a state policy. That's an issue, I know that. So teachers have to be very careful, but their unions can speak up for them, and they are, more and more. New York, New Jersey are two states where the teacher unions have really spoken up. And what are they telling parents to do? Opt your kids out of the tests. This is stunning. We've never had anything like this happen in this country before. But New Jersey and New York, both the unions, large unions, have been saying we want parents to opt their kids out of these tests. You can Google and find all of this available. It's there on the web. So you've got parents who are looking at peculiar things in the math curriculum. I can't go into the details. And people who are looking in private or non-sectarian or sectarian private schools as well as public schools at what their kids are being asked to read and asking questions about, is this what kids should be reading at this grade or in school or at all? They simply are raising questions. And their teachers usually can't answer. And this is one of the things you have to respect. They're being told what to do in many cases. Some school systems have been paying for a so-called Common Core consultant. Back in Arkansas, where I was working for a while, $200,000 a year for the Common Core consultant, who was telling the English teachers what they should be teaching and doing, what kinds of questions they should be asking. In any event, you have teachers who are following directions and want to keep their jobs. Administrators who may be concerned about what will happen when they move on to the next position they may want. So they're supporting what they're hearing from a Department of Education, which often in many states, including this one, cannot cite you any statute that covers what is happening. Parents can opt their kids out. This is something I'm going to move up ahead very quickly to talk about, because it's a parent's right, and parents have had this right for 400 years, whether you were colonies or territories. You can keep your kid at home if they're sick. You can decide you don't want them to go on a particular field trip. You can decide if you don't want your child to take a test that has been mandated by the federal or state government, criterion reference test or standardized test, not a teacher-made test. Those are different. So parents have this right, and there's no statute in any state's body of law that says parents cannot do this. You may have statutes that say you need 95% participation rate for Title I money, and the schools have to offer the test, but it doesn't mean the parent must send the child to take the test. There is a difference between what is in the statute and what many parents are being told. In any event, you have problems with English language arts. The math, as I say, I will not go into detail for. There is Professor Milgram has raised a major question about when the standard algorithms, and these are the procedures that are used in basic arithmetical operations, when they're introduced. According to him, and he deals with students who come from the Pacific Rim universities in Stanford, by grade 8, our students will be about 2 grades behind their competition. That's his estimate, based on knowing what math is taught in Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, other countries in the area who send students to places like Stanford or for graduate work or other areas, or he's visited these countries. Math, after all, is the same around the world. And Common Core math will have, by grade 8, maybe about 2 years behind. It doesn't require completion of Algebra 1 until grade 9 or early grade 10, which is also a problem. And because there are topics left out that he thinks are crucial, by the time students finish a Common Core math curriculum, based on its standards, they may be several grades behind their peers in other countries. This is what he sees as the critical issue. because engineering colleges everywhere expect students to begin their freshman year with calculus. Usually they have had to take a trig course. But he says the trig standards are mostly not there. So you have to be able, if you don't understand high school math yourself, talk to your chair